They always said I'd amount to nothing. My parents used to tell people I was their quiet disappointment, while my sister, oh, she was their miracle child. When she got engaged, they handed her a house like it was a birthday card. When I asked where I'd live, my mom just smiled and said, "Somewhere more fitting for your lifestyle." That night, I stood outside that perfect house they gifted her. White fences, fairy lights, laughter spilling from every window, and I promised myself something. If they wouldn't see my worth, I'd build something so undeniable, the world would remember my name before they ever remembered theirs. And years later, when my parents came begging me for help, standing on the same porch they once said I didn't belong to, I didn't say a word. I just smiled, because karma already had. People say favoritism fades when you grow up, but in my family, it only evolved. From the moment I can remember, my parents saw my sister, Clara, as the proof of everything they'd done right, and me as everything they'd done wrong. Clara was born 2 years after me, but somehow she always seemed 2 lifetimes ahead in their eyes. She was the one who brought home trophies, who smiled perfectly in pictures, who said the right things at the right time. My parents would beam at her like she was sunlight. Me, I was just the quiet shadow that followed her around. At the dinner table, when Clara talked about her school play or her art contest, my dad would lean forward, hanging on every word. When I tried to talk about my science project, or how I'd been working on something new, he'd just say, "That's nice, son. Maybe next time you'll do something we can actually show people." It's strange. The first time your heart breaks isn't always from love. Sometimes it's from realizing you could win a medal, bring home a perfect grade, do everything right, and it would still never be enough. By the time we were teenagers, my parents' priorities became clear. Every penny, every ounce of attention, every opportunity went to Clara. Private art lessons, theater workshops, vacations, for her inspiration. When I asked if I could go to a computer camp that cost half as much, my mother said, "You don't need that. You're more of a practical person, not a visionary like your sister." That word, practical, haunted me. It was a cage. By the time I graduated high school, my parents were already talking about Clara's future, like it was a royal coronation. She wanted to attend an expensive arts college in another state. Tuition my parents could barely afford. They sold an old property, took loans, and threw a party when she got in. When it came to my turn, I didn't even ask. I already knew the answer. Instead, I applied for scholarships, took student loans, and moved into a small apartment near a community college. While Clara posted photos of art galleries and dorm parties, I worked nights at a grocery store and spent mornings studying computer design. It wasn't glamorous. No judgment, no hierarchy, just quiet focus. Still, holidays were brutal. Whenever I went home, I could feel it. The subtle disappointment when I parked my beat-up car in the driveway next to Clara's new one, a gift for surviving her first year of college. At dinner, my parents would praise her like she'd cured cancer. And when the spotlight turned to me, there was only one question. "So, how's life going?" Always with that tone. The one people use when asking if a wound has healed yet. I learned to answer politely. "It's going," I'd say, and it was, just not in the way they expected. Because while Clara painted her way through art school, I started building something of my own. Small freelance design gigs at first, then web projects, then full-on software design. I wasn't making much, but I was learning fast. Faster than anyone gave me credit for. Years passed. Clara graduated to applause and gifts while I quietly finished my degree online. No ceremony. No speeches. Just a click on a screen that said, "Congratulations." By then, my parents had started calling Clara the pride of the family. "The hope he's doing okay, son." When Clara got engaged, the celebration felt like a festival. Every wall of our family home was covered with flowers and pictures. My parents smiled like they'd won the lottery. Then came that night, the one that changed everything. We were sitting at dinner after her engagement announcement, and my father raised a glass. "To new beginnings," he said. "Clara, your mother and I are proud to gift you the house on Meadow Lane." Everyone clapped. I froze. That was our grandfather's house, the one I helped repair during summers, painting walls and fixing gutters when I was just a teenager. The same house my father once promised he'd split fairly between his children someday. And then he looked at me. "Don't worry, son," he said with a half smile. "You'll find your place. Some people bloom later. Maybe one day you'll surprise us all." They laughed. Clara reached over, patted my hand, and said softly, "It's okay. Not everyone's meant for big things." Something in me broke that night, not in anger, but in silence. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just nodded and smiled like the obedient son they always wanted me to be. But when I drove home to my tiny apartment, lights flickering, ceiling leaking, I sat there for hours, staring at the peeling paint on my walls, thinking about that house. The laughter, the champagne glasses, the way they looked at me like I was invisible. That was the night I made a quiet promise. If they couldn't see my worth, I'd stop showing them my pain. I'd build something they could never take credit for or take away. And I did. It didn't happen overnight. At first, it was chaos. Sleeping 4 hours a night, juggling side jobs, teaching myself everything I could about digital systems, automation, and design strategy. But every insult they threw at me, every doubt, every pitying look, became fuel. While Clara posted her new homeowner photos, I was building prototypes on my old laptop. When my parents bragged about her gallery show, I was negotiating with a small startup overseas to buy my first app. They never knew, and I didn't tell them. Not out of spite, but because it was peaceful. For once, I was living without their shadow. By 27, I had something real. A small company, a handful of employees, and a product that actually worked. We weren't rich, not yet, but we were stable. And stability, to me, was freedom. But life has a strange sense of irony, because while I was quietly building something solid, Clara's perfect world was beginning to crack. Her marriage, the one my parents idolized, wasn't the fairy tale they thought. Her husband, a flashy real estate agent, had more charm than loyalty. Rumors started swirling. Debt, affairs, drama. My parents, of course, denied it. "Our Clara's just going through a phase," my mother said once. "Artistic people always have messy lives." Meanwhile, my company began to grow. A deal here, a contract there, a lucky break that turned into real money. For the first time in my life, I had savings. Not pocket change, but real security. I didn't flaunt it, didn't post it online, didn't even buy a new car, because my revenge wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be poetic. And then, one phone call changed everything. It was from my mother. Her voice was shaky, softer than I remembered. "Sweetheart," she said, "can you come home? We need to talk." I almost laughed. "We need to talk." The same words they used when they were disappointed in me. But something in her tone felt different, so I went. When I pulled into the old driveway, I saw Clara's car there, scratched, dented, not the shiny one I remembered. Inside, my parents looked smaller, older, and for the first time in years, they looked afraid. Clara's husband had left her. He drained their accounts, sold assets, and disappeared. The gifted house, mortgaged to the bone. And now, they were weeks away from losing it all. My father cleared his throat, looking anywhere but at me. "We were hoping," he said slowly. "You might help. You're doing well now, aren't you? Maybe just enough to get your sister back on her feet." It was the first time they'd ever called me successful, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like peace. I didn't raise my voice, didn't remind them of the nights I went hungry while they funded her dreams, didn't ask if the house they gifted her still felt like a prize. I just smiled. "Of course," I said quietly, "I'll handle it." They looked relieved, hopeful even, and I did help, just not the way they expected. I walked out of that house and drove straight to a lawyer. The same house that once represented my humiliation was now drowning in unpaid taxes and debt. So I made an offer. A legal one. One they couldn't refuse. A month later, the deed to that house, the one my parents gave away without hesitation, had my name on it, bought, legally mine. When the foreclosure notice arrived, my parents called me in panic. "We're losing everything," my mother cried. "The bank's taken the house." I simply said, "No, Mom, I am." That moment didn't feel like revenge. It felt like closure. Years of silence, pain, and quiet endurance folding into one deep breath of calm. When they showed up at my office weeks later, I didn't gloat. I offered them chairs, tea, and the same politeness they once called weakness. And when my father asked, voice trembling, "How could you?" I finally told him the truth. "I didn't do this to you," I said. "I did this because of you." You taught me that love had to be earned, so I went and earned everything you said I couldn't. Clara moved to another city, trying to rebuild her life. My parents eventually apologized, the kind that comes too late but still carries weight. I forgave them, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Years later, I rented that same house to a small family. Kind people, humble, just trying to start fresh. And every time I drove past, I'd see the lights glowing through the windows. Not from resentment anymore, but from healing. Because sometimes, poetic justice isn't about destroying someone's world. It's about building yours so beautifully. They have to watch it shine from the darkness they created. Perfect, bro. You'd think that moment. Standing in my office, holding the deed to the house that once symbolized my humiliation, would feel like triumph. It didn't. It felt hollow. Because revenge, even when quiet and deserved, carries its own kind of loneliness. For years, I had built my entire world on silence. Every late night, every exhausted morning, every coded line and sleepless decision came from a single wound that refused to heal. And when I finally won, I realized something simple but heavy. They would never understand how much it had cost me. Still, part of me wanted them to see, not to suffer, just to understand. So I let time do what revenge never could, teach them. Clara's life, once painted in gold, started to fade quickly. Her husband's betrayal left her drowning in debts and headlines. Small-town gossip that spreads faster than fire in dry grass. Neighbors whispered. Old friends avoided her. And for the first time, my golden sister stopped shining. My parents tried to protect her image. They always did. People don't need to know everything, my mother would say, pressing fake smiles between tears. But truth has a way of leaking through even the strongest walls. Soon, they sold off jewelry, antiques, anything to keep up appearances. And when that wasn't enough, they called me again. This time, my father didn't sound proud. He sounded desperate. Son, he said, hesitating on the word like it burned his tongue. Can we stay with you? Just for a while, until things settle down. There was a pause, the kind that carries years of history inside it. I remembered every dinner where my words didn't matter. Every moment I'd been the quiet embarrassment. Every time they looked past me to smile at her. And yet, the part of me that had learned empathy from pain couldn't say no. Of course, I said softly. Come over whenever you need. That was the difference between us. They taught me what cruelty felt like, and I refused to return it. They moved into my guest house. I didn't tell them it was mine. They thought I was renting a nice place, not living in the company headquarters I'd built from the ground up. For weeks, they settled in quietly. My father watered the small garden every morning. My mother cooked out of habit. Old recipes that tasted like memories I wasn't sure I wanted back. Clara stayed mostly in her room, painting again, though her work looked darker now. Lonely figures, fading faces, doorways leading to nowhere. Some nights, I'd hear her crying through the walls, and I'd stand in the hallway, listening, wondering if this was karma, or just the cycle of pain repeating itself. One evening, I came home late from work and found my father sitting outside. He was holding a folder, bills, I assumed, and staring at the ground. You've done well, he said after a long silence. It wasn't praise, it was confession. I didn't expect this. You always were the quiet one. I learned to be, I said. He nodded slowly, like the weight of every choice he'd made was finally pressing down on him. Your mother and I. We thought we were helping Clara chase her dreams. We didn't realize we were taking yours away. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that could rewrite the years. But, for the first time, I saw it in his eyes, regret. Real, unfiltered regret. He looked older that night, not because of age, but because of guilt. And I think that's when my revenge started turning into forgiveness, even if I didn't admit it yet. Weeks turned into months. Clara eventually got a part-time job teaching art at a local school. She walked to work, painted on weekends, and avoided mirrors. It was as if she was trying to live quietly enough to disappear. I didn't interfere. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone who broke you is let them live without your judgment. But life, unpredictable as it is, wasn't done testing any of us. One afternoon, I got a call from a city developer. They wanted to buy several old properties in the area, including that house. The same one my parents had once gifted away like candy. It wasn't personal anymore, just business. And that's what made it poetic. I went to visit it one last time before the deal went through. It looked smaller than I remembered, the white fences cracked, paint fading, the garden overgrown. Time had humbled the house that once symbolized everything I wasn't allowed to have. Standing there, I realized how much I'd changed. That house wasn't home anymore. It was just proof that I'd survived without needing their validation. When the sale finalized, I didn't tell my parents right away. I wanted to do something different, something that ended the story, not continued it. The next weekend, I invited them all for dinner. My parents, Clara, even a few old family friends. I told them I had something to share. When they arrived, they were nervous. I'd rented out a quiet restaurant, dim lights, soft music, warm air scented with rosemary and wine. It wasn't grand, it was peaceful. We ate in near silence at first. Then, between courses, my father finally asked, "What's this about?" I smiled. "It's about closure," I said simply. I handed him a folder. Inside was the house deed, the same one that once caused all the pain. But now, under the ownership section, were new names. The Howard Family Shelter. "What is this?" "It's a donation," I said quietly. "The house will become a safe home for kids who grew up like me. Overlooked, underestimated, invisible." No one spoke. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Then Clara whispered, "You gave it away." I nodded. Yes, some stories don't need revenge. They need an ending that heals. My mother cried first, the kind of tears that come from realizing too late that love could have been easier all along. My father just sat there, eyes distant, his hand shaking slightly on the table. "That house was your chance to," he stopped, unable to finish. "To what?" I asked softly. "Prove I was worth loving?" Silence. Only the sound of music and someone clinking a glass in the distance. Then, finally, he looked at me. "No," he said. "To prove we were wrong." It was the first time he ever admitted it, and somehow, that one sentence carried more power than any victory I could have taken. After that night, things changed. Not dramatically, but quietly. The way winter slowly gives in to spring. My parents moved into a smaller home closer to Clara's work. They stopped pretending to be perfect and started learning to be real. Clara, slowly but steadily, rebuilt herself, not as a golden child, but as a woman who'd learned the hard way that admiration without gratitude is empty. And me, I kept building, not out of spite anymore, but purpose. I expanded my company, but I never chased fame or recognition. Instead, I started mentoring students from low-income families, kids who reminded me of myself, smart, curious, but constantly told they weren't enough. One of them once asked me, "How did you get successful if no one believed in you?" And I smiled. Because I stopped waiting for someone to say I could. Months later, I visited the shelter, the old house on Meadow Lane. It had been repainted, renovated, and filled with life again. Laughter echoed through the halls where silence once lived. The room smelled of food, crayons, and hope. A little boy ran up to me, holding a broken toy. "Can you fix this?" he asked. I knelt down, took the toy, and said, "I can try." And as I watched him smile, I realized something I'd never understood before. The best revenge isn't proving others wrong. It's proving yourself right. When I left that day, I looked back one last time at the glowing windows. The laughter, the faint shadow of my younger self standing by the gate. He wasn't angry anymore. He was free. As I drove away, the streetlights flickered in the rearview mirror like fading stars. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the quiet disappointment anymore. I felt like the ending to a story that finally made sense. It's strange how peace feels heavier than anger when you're not used to it. Months passed after I turned the old house into a shelter. Life moved forward, quietly. The noise of the past, the resentment, the comparisons, the bitterness, all began to fade like an echo from another lifetime. But then came the letter. It arrived one Tuesday morning, folded neatly in a plain envelope. No return address. The handwriting was familiar, tight, elegant, and careful. My mother's. For a moment, I just stared at it. I hadn't heard from them in weeks. And even though part of me wanted to ignore it, curiosity, or maybe closure, made me open it. Inside was a short note. "We'd like to see you. There's something we need to say." "Mom." No drama, just that. I hesitated for days. Not because I was angry, but because I wasn't sure what they could possibly say now that hadn't already been said through years of silence. But something in me, maybe the same part that used to wait for their approval, told me to go. So I did. The place they'd moved into wasn't far. A small cottage near the edge of town, quiet and tucked away between fields. It looked peaceful, humble, even a little worn. When I knocked on the door, I half expected that same cold, practiced politeness I grew up with. Instead, when the door opened, I saw something else. My mother, smaller, older, her hair streaked with silver, standing with trembling hands and wet eyes. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice catching. "You came." Her tone was soft, not performative, not polite, just human. My father appeared behind her, slower, careful. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded. There was no superiority in his gaze anymore, only time. They invited me in. The house was modest. Old furniture, a kettle steaming on the stove, half-finished puzzles on the table. It smelled of tea and memory. We sat in silence for a while. No small talk, no pretending things were normal. It was the kind of silence that carried weight. Not awkwardness, but years of unspoken things pressing at the edges of the room. Finally, my father spoke. "I heard about the house," he said quietly. "The shelter." I nodded. He looked down at his hands. Rougher now, thinner than I remembered. "It was good," he said. "It was the right thing to do. I don't think we would have ever done that. Not back then." "That's all right," I said. "You weren't meant to." He smiled sadly. "You sound like your grandfather. That caught me off guard. I hadn't heard him mentioned in years." "Did he ever tell you," my father continued, "that he wanted you to have that house one day?" I shook my head. "He told me once," he said. "Said you had a way of fixing things others gave up on." I didn't listen. I thought he was being sentimental. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Turns out he saw what I didn't. My mother wiped at her eyes with a tissue. "I used to think love meant giving the most to the child who could shine the brightest," she said. "But I was wrong. I gave your sister everything, and I left you to figure out love on your own." Her voice cracked. "When I saw what you did, turning that house into a home for others, I realized something. You became the kind of man we always hoped we'd raise, and we didn't even notice it happening." For years, I thought I wanted this moment, to hear them finally say it. But when it came, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. Because forgiveness isn't about being proven right. It's about letting go of the part of you that still needs to be. Then my father reached for a small box sitting on the table. He pushed it toward me. "Your grandfather's watch," he said. "It's old, but it still works. He wanted you to have it. We just didn't think you'd care back then." Inside was a simple silver watch, scratched but intact. The kind of thing that looks ordinary until you realize the story it carries. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It wasn't about the gift. It was about the gesture. A circle closing. We talked for hours that night, not about success or failure or who was better, but about simple things. Old memories, moments I'd forgotten to remember kindly. For the first time, we laughed together. Not as people competing for love, but as a family that had finally stopped keeping score. When I left, my father followed me to the door. He hesitated, then said softly, "I know it doesn't change anything, but thank you for not becoming like us." That line stayed with me, because he was right. The real revenge wasn't turning into them. It was breaking the pattern. Weeks later, I visited the shelter again. The children there had started a small garden in the backyard, tiny green sprouts pushing through the soil. One of the volunteers told me they called it the Garden of Second Chances. I stood there for a long while, watching the kids laugh, chase each other, share snacks. And I thought about how strange life can be. How pain can build the softest kind of kindness. How rejection can raise empathy in places love should have lived first. And how sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who end up teaching you what healing really looks like. Months passed like seasons shifting, slowly, quietly, beautifully. Clara reached out more often, not for money, not for help, just to talk. She'd started selling her paintings again, not in big galleries this time, but local fairs, community shows, and online. She told me she felt freer than ever. "Do you ever think about the past?" she asked once over coffee. "All the things we didn't see," sometimes I said. "But mostly, I think about the future. The kind we still get to build." She smiled. "You know, I used to think you hated me." "I did," I said honestly, "but hate's heavy. I just got tired of carrying it." The years that followed were quiet and good, not glamorous, but grounded. My company grew. My family healed in pieces. And every now and then, I'd get a letter from one of the kids at the shelter, written in messy crayon handwriting. Thank you for our beds. I like the blue room the best. When I grow up, I want to build a house too. Little notes that reminded me why I'd done it all. Why revenge turned into something else along the way. Something better. One autumn afternoon, I visited the shelter again. This time with my parents. They hadn't been there since I turned it over to the foundation. The director greeted us warmly and gave us a tour. Children played in the yard, volunteers painted the walls a soft yellow, and laughter filled the air. My mother walked slowly through the hallway, touching the door frames like she was walking through time itself. My father stayed behind, silent, his eyes glassy. When we reached the backyard, one of the kids, maybe 6 or 7, ran up and handed my father a small flower. Here, he said proudly, for you. My father knelt down, voice trembling. Thank you, son. He called him son. That broke something open in him, I think. He stood up, looked at me, and whispered, You turned that house into what it should have always been. I smiled. I just fixed what was broken. That evening, after they left, I stayed behind as the sun dipped low. The sky was painted in soft gold, the kind that only appears for a few fleeting minutes before fading into night. I walked to the old gate, the one I used to stand outside as a boy, wishing I could belong. It was rusted now, creaking slightly in the wind, but still there, and for a moment I could almost see him. My younger self, standing on the other side of that gate. Hungry for approval, desperate to be seen. He looked at me silently, as if asking whether it was worth it. All the pain, the loneliness, the struggle, and I wanted to tell him yes, every second of it. Because everything they said I wasn't became everything I was meant to be. As I left, I looked up one last time. The windows glowed softly, children's laughter echoing like music in the old house. Once a symbol of rejection, had become something sacred. That was the real empire I built, not with money, not with pride, but with peace. Got it, bro. This is where we land the story. There's a saying my grandfather used to repeat when I was little, something I never understood until much later he'd say. The loudest victories are often the quietest ones. Back then, I thought victory meant applause, proof. Now, standing in the stillness of everything I'd built, I finally understood what he meant. Because sometimes the biggest win isn't proving them wrong. It's living so right that you no longer need to. The years that followed weren't perfect, but they were honest. My parents grew old quietly, no longer chasing appearances or pretending to be the flawless couple they once wanted the world to see. They volunteered at the shelter sometimes, reading to the kids, planting flowers, teaching small lessons about life. People there didn't know who they were to me. They were just Mr. and Mrs. Howard. The kind volunteers who showed up with warm soup and soft smiles. And that was enough. Clara started visiting often too. Her art evolved, less glitter, more truth. She painted what she felt instead of what people wanted her to. And slowly, her work started finding its way into the world again. Not through galleries, but through hearts. She once told me, I used to think our parents' approval was the key to happiness. Turns out, it was the lock. That line stayed with me. Maybe it's true for all of us. Sometimes, you spend years trying to open a door that was never meant for you. One day, I got a call from the shelter's director. He said one of the older kids, a boy named Jacob, was turning 18. He wants to see you, he said. He's been waiting. I didn't recognize the name at first, but when I arrived, I did. Jacob was one of the first kids who'd moved into the shelter when it opened. A small, scared 10-year-old who used to hide behind the curtains whenever new people came. Now, he was taller, steadier, but still had that same quiet in his eyes that I once knew too well. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a drawing. The old house, the shelter, kids playing in the garden. At the bottom, he'd written, "Thank you for fixing things." I couldn't speak for a moment, because that was it. The entire story, the whole circle, wrapped into one line, written by a kid who didn't even know he'd just closed a chapter I'd been carrying my whole life. When I left the shelter that day, the world felt softer somehow. The road home was lined with the same trees that had been there since my childhood, but they didn't seem as tall anymore. Maybe I'd just finally grown into myself. At home, I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window. The silver watch my father gave me ticked quietly on my wrist. It was still working, Steady, patient, unbroken. Like me. A few months later, I visited my parents again. My mother had been gardening in the backyard, her hands dirt-stained, her smile peaceful. My father sat on the porch, reading. For once, it felt like the home I'd always wanted. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. When I sat beside him, he looked at me and said, "Do you ever think about the past?" "Every day," I said, "but not with anger anymore," he nodded slowly. "I used to think regret was the worst punishment a man could have. But now I see. It's a chance to start over, if you let it be." We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. Some silences mean pain. Others mean peace. That one was peace. Time moved forward, as it always does. Years slipped by like pages turning on their own. The company grew, but I never forgot where it started. In a cramped apartment with a flickering bulb, and a promise whispered to no one but myself sometimes. New interns would ask about the story behind our foundation. I never told them the full truth. I'd just say, it began with a house and a choice. The house wasn't mine, but the choice was. Because that's the lesson I learned. Your past doesn't decide your story. Your choices do. Even the small, quiet ones. One winter, my father passed away. Peacefully. He'd been reading when it happened, his glasses still resting on the open page. At his funeral, there weren't many people. Just family, a few neighbors, and some kids from the shelter who'd grown up and wanted to pay their respects. Clara spoke first, trembling but composed. Then my mother read a short note he'd written months before. It said, "I used to think legacy was built on wealth, houses, or family pride, but I learned too late. Real legacy is what people feel after you leave the room." My son taught me that. She couldn't finish reading it. Clara took her hand. I just stood there, listening to the soft wind through the trees, thinking about how strange forgiveness is. How it doesn't erase pain, but makes space for love to live beside it. After the funeral, I visited the shelter again. The kids were decorating for winter, hanging paper snowflakes and old ornaments. One of them asked if I wanted to help. I smiled and joined in, cutting out uneven shapes and laughing when they fell apart. At some point, one of the volunteers turned on a small radio, and an old song started playing. Something from the time when my life still revolved around trying to prove myself. But now, it just sounded like background noise in a story that had already ended the way it was supposed to. When the sun began to set, the director came over and handed me a small box. "This was found in the attic," he said. "Thought you might want it." Inside was an old photo. My grandfather standing in front of the same house, holding a little boy by the hand. Me, on the back, in faded ink was written, "Someday he'll understand." I smiled. He was right. I finally did. Now when people ask what success feels like, I tell them the truth. It doesn't feel like applause or luxury or numbers on a screen. It feels like standing in front of a house that once rejected you, and realizing it no longer defines who you are. It feels like watching the people who once broke you learn how to love again. It feels like the sound of laughter replacing the silence that used to hurt. And most of all, it feels like peace. The kind you build, not find. The kind that doesn't need to be loud to be real. Sometimes I drive past Meadow Lane at night. The house glows softly in the dark, and I see shadows of children running through the windows, laughing, playing, living. They don't know the history of those walls. They don't know the pain, the betrayal, the long road that led here. And that's perfect, because it means the story did what it was supposed to. It ended, not in anger, not in revenge, but in quiet, poetic justice, the kind that turns old wounds into warm light. As I drive away, the watch ticks steadily on my wrist. Each second, a small reminder. Time doesn't heal everything. It just gives you space to build something beautiful between the scars. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. When I was young, I used to wait for someone to tell me I was enough. Now, I tell others. And they believe it sooner than I ever did. Maybe that's the greatest revenge of all. Not proving them wrong, but helping others believe they were never wrong to begin with. Because at the end of it all, the empire I built wasn't made of money or pride or power. It was made of peace. And peace. That's the one thing they can never take away.